This is Phil Koopman, and I'll be talking about redefining safety for autonomous vehicles. As an overview of the talk, I believe it is time for computer-based system safety to evolve, and in particular, some terminology update is required that goes beyond just redefining terms, but reframes how we think about safety for these types of systems. And the events and incidents we've seen with autonomous systems, in particular robotaxis in the last couple of years, really show us where we need to improve if we want to have more robust, more encompassing definitions of safety. The heart of the talk is a walk through a definitional buildup, including loss, risk, safety constraints, safety engineering, safety case, and acceptable safety. So we'll go slide by slide defining these terms to show how they fit together to increase the scope of what it means to be safe and update terms to account for the types of issues we see arising when there's no human person in charge of the operation of an automated system. The viewpoint we end up with is that safety is more of a constraint satisfaction problem than a risk optimization problem. That may sound abstract at this point, but we'll get there as we get through the talk. Let's start with, are things really broken? Well, I'll give you a couple examples, and we can see that things probably need to be updated to really encompass what's happening. First, let's look at safety case. And the usual definition is that it's a structured argument supported by evidence and so on, but the definition ends with in a given operating environment. Well, let's take an example. What if we're talking about an aircraft? The pilot is in charge of making sure to not operate the aircraft in adverse weather that the aircraft can't handle. Okay, that's where in a given operating environment makes sense. But what if the pilot's a robot? Can we say that we are going to exclude that from the safety case? I don't think so. The computer has to actually enforce the limitations. So the issue we have here is that autonomous vehicles operate in open, incompletely defined environments. And we're going to have unexpected obstacles, unexpected vehicle types, unexpected situations, and so on. So excluding that from the definition of safety doesn't really make sense because they have to self-enforce. A couple recent examples include a Waymo robotaxi crashing into a utility pole. According to their public statements, it seems that all utility poles were tagged with low severity, meaning okay to crash into it, which is clearly the problem. But this did not emerge until they found a utility pole to crash into that was not protected by a curb. Because curbs are not okay to crash into, and if the utility pole is behind a curb, then you'll never encounter the utility pole. But in this case, it was a parking alley, and the pole was out in the middle of the pavement, and they happened to crash into it. You can say, well, the safety case can ignore utility poles that are not protected by curbs because we haven't seen one yet, but that doesn't mean the crash won't happen. Another example is a Cruise robotaxi crashed into the back of a 60-foot articulated bus. Conventional buses are about 40 feet long and they do not have a pivot in the middle, and it had been trained on those. So apparently when it encountered a bus with a pivot that was another 20 feet longer, it decided to ignore the back half of the bus and say, well, I know buses are 40 feet long, so I have more room to operate. Even though it detected the back of the bus, it decided to ignore it and crashed into it. Both of these you can consider as straight up software defects. But at a deeper level, what's happening is you could have a safety case that says, oh, these systems are completely safe. But because there's something missing from their model of the operating environment, they have a problem. So limiting the safety case to only worry about what happens when you understand the environment leaves out the part where you don't actually understand the environment, and that's inherent to these types of systems. Another way in which the current definitions for safety might be broken is the definition of risk. The usual definition of risk is something about combination of probability and severity. And also there's the notion of positive risk balance. Well, if we're safer than a human driver, then possibly that's okay. But that risk definition is kind of narrow. What about risk redistribution onto vulnerable populations? What if, and this is hypothetical, what if the number of fatalities from self-driving cars was half that of human drivers, 50% reduction? That'd be great, except what if it's also the case that every single victim was a child in a crosswalk in a school zone? Now that's obviously hypothetical, but that's not going to be okay. So net risk is important, but there's more to it than that. There are other considerations beyond just probability and severity multiplied without distinguishing different classes of victims in different circumstances. It's not going to be enough to reduce average risk if we also see vulnerable populations put at proportionally increased risk. Now, this is not hypothetical. We actually see a little bit of this happening already. In San Francisco, there's a neighborhood called the Tenderloin District, which is well known to be economically distressed and has a high drug use, and likely related to that has a very high rate of emergency response activity. And so what we've seen is 11 of 74 incidents reported by San Francisco Fire Department with robotaxis interfering with operations have occurred in this area, which is a very small part of San Francisco. Beyond that, 2 significant injury events happened right at the border of this district. One was a cruise robotaxi collision with a fire truck that was responding to an emergency scene, and the other was the tragic cruise pedestrian dragging mishap happened just a block away from the Tenderloin. So one could argue that the Tenderloin, which is a vulnerable population, is experiencing a very high risk from testing of robotaxis. And that sort of thing is not really captured by a purely utilitarian probability and severity calculation. So there's some key insights from everything we've seen with these robotaxis, and the paper that accompanied this talk goes into many more examples. But what we found out is that robots can fail even if they do not drive drunk. Saying, well, robots will be such good drivers that there's really no point worrying about risk, that's not going to happen. You've already seen some pictures of the types of crashes that were not supposed to happen with computer drivers, but they're happening. Beyond that, we ask, is negligent driving okay? What if a computer breaks road rules? What if there's uneven risk distribution? Should losses due to rare events be okay? What we sometimes see from those robotaxi companies is, oh, this particular scenario is very rare, so it should not count. Well, rare high consequence events kind of matter a lot. And so I think we need to dig deeper than claims of net statistical risk and get some granularity into what risk and safety should really mean for these vehicles. There's a big difference here. What has changed with robotaxis? Well, what has changed is there's no human operator to blame or to take responsibility. Who's responsible for negligent driving? It used to be the designers of a car did not have to worry about negligent driving because that was the human's problem. But now you have a computer driving a car, and if it fails to yield to a fire truck with its lights on and someone gets hurt, who exactly is the negligent driver in this situation? And who or what monitors for a given environment in the definition of safety case? And what about social interactions? Things like legal compliance are traditionally out of scope for safety, but now that you have a computer responsible for obeying traffic laws, you can no longer say that legal issues are out of scope because they're clearly in scope if you're operating on public roads. So let's explore revising safety terminology. We're going to walk through terms one by one and show what the current terms do, why it is that they might need to change, and have some very concrete proposals for new terminology that gets us in the place we want to go without really breaking the old definitions, but encompassing these new concerns. Let's start going term by term. The first term is the definition of loss. ISO 26262 uses the term harm rather than loss and limits it to physical injury to people, including fatalities. But what about other incidents? There are other aspects of safety that matter beyond just injuring or killing people. Here's an example where a robotaxi killed someone's pet dog. Now, I'm not trying to equate killing a dog with killing a person, but it's clear that many people take any injury to their pet very seriously. If you want to be socially acceptable on public roads, you cannot assign 0 as the risk associated with killing a pet. There has to be some other consideration. There are other things beyond just pets that matter. So we will use the term loss instead of harm to avoid confusion and call loss an adverse outcome. And it's really any adverse outcome. It could include injury or death to people, to animals, damage to the environment, property, and in particular, negative societal externalities. We'll come back to that one. So loss is a very expansive term. Now, we are not saying that all types of loss are weighted equally. That's not the intent here. But the point is you have to consider all the types of loss, with some types of loss having higher consequence than others. The next definition is risk. Classical risk is a combination of probability and severity, and in ISO 26262, they throw controllability into the mix for computing automotive safety integrity levels, ASILs. Ultimately, traditional risk is pretty utilitarian. It boils down to monetary equivalent, insurance, whether or not you would have to spend more to remediate the risk than the risk would cause in losses, and so on. But there's more to societally acceptable safety than a purely monetary basis. Also, we see recalls based on not just probability and severity calculations, but rather patterns of avoidable losses. As an example, there was a large investigation from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration on Teslas that eventually encompassed 956 Tesla crashes, 29 fatalities, and what they saw were patterns of avoidable frontal collisions, loss of yaw control, and also inadvertent auto steer override, where the driver accidentally turned off auto steer and had a crash because they thought it was still on. That resulted in a recall. The important thing here is, even if you believe that Teslas on average are acceptably safe, the presence of these patterns of losses led to a recall. So if you want acceptable safety, it's more than just probability and severity. You also have to account for avoidable patterns of losses. Our definition of risk accounts for this. It includes probability of occurrence of a loss, but also probability of patterns of losses. And rather than saying severity, it talks about the importance to stakeholders of the consequences, and we'll revisit stakeholders in a moment. A safety constraint is a term that you usually do not see in safety standards right now, but which I think is pivotal to really changing how we think about safety. Typically, safety is more thought of as net minimization of the sum of risks. But the problem with that has always been, what do you do about zero probability times catastrophic consequence? There is significant incentive at design time to say, well, it'll never happen, so the risk is zero. But then we see events happen out in the real world where they were wrong about that, it did find a way to happen, and the consequence was very high. So rather than insist on a purely mathematical approach where things with zero probability are assumed to have zero risk, instead there are things that the consequence is so high we probably don't want them to occur even if we're not really sure what the risk is. There's also risk due to negative externalities. There are problems in San Francisco where robotaxis were blocking fire trucks reporting to scenes, blocking ambulances. They were causing trouble at emergency response scenes, just generally being a nuisance. But they were also parking in firehouse driveways, which meant if there were a fire, the fire trucks could not get out of the firehouse. How is a design team for robotaxis supposed to assign a consequence to this type of thing? There's no problem with the car. It did a safety shutdown. It just happens to be blocking fire trucks. And how are they supposed to actually know what the consequence is from a risk point of view for blocking a fire truck? Because it all depends. As it turns out, there were no deaths attributable to this so far, but it's the kind of thing that if it goes wrong, it can go really wrong. So we're back to an actual loss event being low probability, but could be really catastrophic if you have a burning skyscraper. So what do you do about this? Well, what we do about this for human drivers is we have rules and regulations. We say you as a human driver are not allowed to do things against the rules even if you think it's low risk to you because the risk to society is too high or the risk to other road users is too high. In our definitions, we'll account for this by defining a thing called a safety constraint. A safety constraint is limitation imposed on risk by some stakeholder other than the system designer. And the idea here is it's not good enough to just minimize net risk. You also have to obey the safety constraints, many of which exist because you do not have the scope of knowledge or the authority to take on risks that have high negative externalities. The next definition is safety engineering. Testing alone does not create safe software. That's important enough, I'll say it a second time. Testing alone does not create safe software. We've known that for decades, and yet the industry keeps telling us that they have so many million miles of driving that proves they're safe. First of all, you need more like 1 billion miles to prove they're safe under some assumptions that probably are not true. But secondly, that doesn't actually make you safe. That's just a demonstration of lack of unsafety. The way we get safety, the way we've always gotten safety, is by doing safety engineering. Safety engineering is a methodical process, and it typically involves things such as hazard analysis and risk assessment and risk mitigation and validation. And in this definition, I've added field engineering feedback and lifecycle management, because in an open environment, periodic updates are not optional. They will be required, because even if you found everything in the environment, which you won't, the environment will change the next day. These updates are going to happen for the life of the system. The point here is you cannot claim acceptable safety unless you can show you're doing a methodical safety engineering process. Testing alone will not let you claim acceptable safety under this set of terminology. Now we're up to safety case. And as I said before, safety case ends with given application in a given environment. But what about an open environment? We had that cruise crashing into the back of a bus because it was an open environment. They hadn't thought of that. You're never going to have a given environment. So it's not okay to say, well, we've proved we're safe with this safety case, assuming some environment that doesn't really exist in the real world. That safety case isn't really that useful because it excludes the things that are most likely to cause severe harm, which is the surprises. What about enforcing operational limits? Well, we used to have a human driver who would say, no, I don't think I'm going to drive in that because my car can't handle it. Well, there's no human driver anymore. The whole point is there's no human driver. So who or what is enforcing the operational limits? And that's the computer driver. So the safety case has to say you're safe even outside the intended application, and you're safe even outside the intended environment. It does not have to say you operate there, but it has to ensure safety happens, for example, by some sort of safe shutdown. There's a related issue of intentional misuse. And intentional misuse sounds like it's bad people trying to be bad, but it's much more subtle than that in practice. We've seen a number of Tesla drivers who were caught out driving while drunk and using autopilot or full self-driving. And there's an issue here. You can say, well, this is just a bad actor who's trying to evade blame. But I've had a number of personal experiences that suggest that's not the whole story. For sure, there are people who think that if you turn on autopilot or full self-driving, it will get you home safely even though you're drunk. And these are educated, earnest, well-intentioned people, not just Tesla owners, but some legal professionals think that this is the case, that if you have someone who loses their license for DUI, buying them a Tesla is a good way to get them safely back on the road. I know that's incorrect thinking, but that kind of idea is out there. So intentional misuse does not necessarily have to be malicious. It could simply be by people who don't understand the full restrictions of the system. If we want self-driving technology to really be safe, we have to account for intentional misuse, or we're not going to get to safety. So what does our safety case need to do? Well, it's a structured argument supported by a body of evidence that provides a compelling, comprehensible, and sound argument that safety, at that point, it's the usual words we've seen in previous standards, but it's safety engineering efforts. So we're going to require safety engineering to be there. It cannot just be testing. And they've ensured a system meets comprehensive set of safety constraints. So you have to structure it as a safety constraint exercise rather than simply a risk optimization exercise. The last definition, we finally get to the capstone of this whole thing, which is acceptable safety. There's more to safety than positive risk balance. I've been talking about this in general, but let's list some specific issues here. You need to meet ethical constraints, such as avoiding risk distribution onto vulnerable populations. You have to avoid negligent driving, although there is a thing such as justifiable road rule violations, and the computer driver is going to have to figure that out and get it right. You can have no recallable behaviors, even if net risk is okay. And you need to meet legal restrictions. One of the things we saw in San Francisco is robotaxis were dropping off passengers in the middle of the road or in otherwise illegal manners. That produces some risk to the passengers who are getting in or getting out, but it also clogs up road traffic. The legal restrictions are there for a reason, and now that there's no human driver present, the computer needs to obey the law. But what do we mean by acceptably safe? We say acceptably safe. Acceptable to whom? And the answer is kind of to everybody. The auto industry and the insurance industry definitely have opinions about what is acceptable, but theirs are very financially driven. Regulators and legislators want to encourage innovation without stifling it, but they have some expectations that their constituents will be kept safe. And road users and consumer advocates also have things to say. it should not be that the car makers make all the decisions and just deploy the technology. To get acceptable safety, you need input from all these stakeholders. That's a social and political process to be sure, but it's what we need to do. So acceptable is meets all safety constraints as shown by a safety case. Summarizing, I think we need some new definitions for safety because the lack of a human driver in a car really breaks a lot of the assumptions we had built into safety cases. And this is for more than cars. If you have an aircraft that has no pilot, you have all the same sort of dynamics that there's no pilot to take responsibility for a lot of the things that the computer now has to do. In particular, there's no human there to deal with surprises in the environment. There's no human there to enforce operational limits. There's no human there to do the right thing when there's a rule interpretation that's ambiguous or there are conflicting rules or some emergency force is violating rules within reason. There's no human to do that. Now the computer has to handle it. And there are legal and ethical constraints that have to be in scope for engineering efforts because the computer is the only thing there that can obey those constraints. One might say, can't we just reinterpret existing terms? Do we really need to change the terminology? And I have two reasons I believe that we really need to change the terminology. One is that minimal compliance organizations exist and they're likely to fall short because their incentive is to do the least possible work to meet the letter of the standard. And if the standard doesn't change, they're not going to change what they consider as safe. The second reason is terms should say what they mean. So if you have a safety standard that has terminology that fails to account for all the challenges with autonomous systems, let's say you have a person reading an existing safety standard but building an autonomous system, and they read the old style terminology, how would they know that all these other things should be taken into consideration, and where would they even look to get a consistent view on what the new terminology should be? I think these terms should be standardized using a robust international standardization process. But I also think that it's time to update the standard terminology. I don't think we should wait longer. There's an extended paper that addresses not only this terminology, but also provides numerous examples of the types of robotaxi issues we've seen that motivate this terminology change, and also compares it to the existing terminology in quite a number of standards. To wrap up, here's a list of all the definitions I've gone through all in one slide. You can see these terms in this paper. The proposal is to update a core set of definitions for safety that includes loss, risk, safety constraint, safety engineering, safety case, and acceptable. And once you do that, all the other terminology and all the other pieces should line up.